Welcome, brave souls, to tonight's terror-filled journey. I'll be your terror tour guide through the shadows, leading you into the depths of the unknown. Before we dive into the hair-raising stories ahead, I have a small favor to ask. Did you know only 15% of our viewers have subscribed? By hitting that subscribe button, you'll help us continue bringing these chilling tales to life. Your support means the world to us. Now, settle in, brace yourself, and let the darkness unfold, if you dare. I had always shared a complicated relationship with my mother, a bond woven with threads of love, resentment, and so many unspoken words. Growing up, I often felt overshadowed by her strong personality. She was fiercely independent, unyielding in her beliefs, a woman of conviction. I admired her, but I also rebelled against her. I craved her approval as a child, yet I could never seem to meet her expectations. That tension carried into adulthood, where our conversations were often strained, leaving so much unresolved. Despite it all, I loved her deeply, and when I heard the news of her passing, I was overwhelmed with grief, guilt, and a longing for closure that felt impossible to reach. The day of the funeral passed in a haze. As I stood in the funeral home, surrounded by family and friends, the weight of her absence pressed down on me like a physical force. The room was steeped in mourning, but there was an eerie stillness that I couldn't shake. As the service unfolded, I found myself retreating into my thoughts, replaying memories of her, moments of joy, moments of pain. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and faint, calling my name. Isabel. It was barely more than a whisper, almost like the wind, but it cut through the room's somber quiet. My heart skipped, and I glanced around, expecting to see someone nearby. But the mourners were solemn and still, their attention fixed on the casket. The voice came again, clearer this time, insistent. Isabel. A chill ran down my spine. I felt a strange pull toward the back of the room, as if something or someone was beckoning me. I hesitated, torn between staying in the moment and following this haunting call that resonated deep within me. The air felt charged, almost electric, and I could sense something. It was as though unseen eyes were watching me, urging me forward. I took a deep breath and stepped away from the crowd, drawn to the shadows at the edge of the room. As I moved, the tension in my chest began to ease, replaced by an inexplicable sense of calm. The whispers grew louder, clearer, guiding me to a quiet corner bathed in dim light. And there, I felt it, a presence. It wasn't cold or frightening. It was warm, comforting, like an embrace I'd been missing for years. Isabel. The voice was no longer just a sound. It was her. My mother. Tears welled in my eyes as the realization hit me. This was her voice calling out to me, bridging the chasm that had always seemed so wide between us. In that moment, it was as if all the pain, all the tension, all the unspoken words dissolved. I began to speak, my voice trembling as years of bottled emotions spilled out. I told her how much I had longed for her approval, how inadequate I had often felt, and how much I regretted the unresolved conflicts between us. The weight of her expectations, which I had carried like a heavy cloak, seemed to lift with every word I said. And then her voice came again. Not words, but a feeling, a wave of reassurance and forgiveness. It was as though she was wrapping me in a love so profound that it transcended the boundaries of life and death. I cried openly, not out of sadness, but from a sense of release. For the first time, I felt truly connected to her, without the complications that had always clouded our bond. When the funeral service ended, I stepped back into the room transformed. The eerie voice that had once filled me with uncertainty now resonated with peace. I understood that her spirit would always be with me, guiding me, celebrating me, loving me. I returned to the gathering, my heart lighter, my grief tempered by the closure I never thought I'd find. As I stood among friends and family, I felt gratitude, not just for the love we had shared, but for the complexities of our relationship that had made that love so real. It was imperfect, messy, and sometimes painful, but it was ours. And now I could finally carry it forward with clarity and understanding. The medical school campus lay shrouded in darkness, an eerie silence blanketing the grounds as the moon cast a pale glow over the buildings. The once bustling hallways were now empty, the only sounds the distant rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional groan of the old structure settling into the night. I was a first-year medical student, eager and overwhelmed, and I had stayed late in the anatomy lab to study. It was late, closer to midnight than I cared to admit, and though I'd always been fascinated by the lab, tonight it felt different. The air was heavy and a creeping unease began to take hold. The anatomy lab was vast and sterile, lined with rows of tables, each prepared meticulously for dissection. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I tried to focus on my notes, but the shadows felt alive, shifting and swirling just beyond my vision. It was as if the room itself was watching me, its presence oppressive and unrelenting. The refrigeration unit in the corner hummed rhythmically, a sound I usually found comforting. But tonight, it felt ominous. Then it happened. A loud, rattling noise erupted from the refrigeration unit, startling me so badly that I nearly dropped my pen. The noise echoed through the room, bouncing off the metal tables and walls. My heart leaped into my throat and I froze, staring at the unit. It wasn't uncommon for the machinery to make noise, but this was different. Sharp, deliberate, like someone inside was shaking it. I hesitated, my mind racing. Was it malfunctioning? Or was it something else? I'd heard the stories whispered among upper-class men. Ghostly apparitions, shadows that moved on their own, cold spots that left students shivering despite the lab's temperature controls. There was even a legend about a student who had vanished years ago, said to haunt the lab in search of answers he'd never found in life. The rattling grew louder, more urgent, and a chill swept through the room, making me shiver. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the eerie ambiance playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stood and approached the refrigeration unit, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound grew louder. A series of sharp clinks and clatters, as if whatever was inside was desperate to get out. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. Cold air rushed out, making my breath visible in the frigid air. Inside, the cadavers lay still, their forms shrouded in white sheets. The rattling stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I scanned the interior, my eyes darting between the motionless bodies. But nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to shut the door, a shadow darted across the far wall, disappearing into the darkness. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the door shut, stepping back as my breath came in shallow gasps. My mind raced. Was it real? Had I actually seen something? The stories I dismissed as exaggerations suddenly felt all too plausible, and then I heard it. A whisper, soft and faint, but unmistakable. "Help me." My blood ran cold. The voice was so quiet, almost a sigh, but it was real. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears as the realization hit me. I was not alone. The shadows seemed to deepen, pressing closer, and the rattling resumed, louder this time, more desperate. The voice came again, clearer now. "Help me." I couldn't stay. Every instinct screamed at me to run, and I didn't argue. Bolting for the door, I fled the lab, the whispers and rattling echoing in my ears as I burst into the night. Even as I left the building behind, the unease lingered. The stories about the anatomy lab were more than just tales. They were warnings, reminders of the mysteries hidden within those walls. And I had come too close to uncovering one of them. In the small town of Denton, the name of Dr. Samuel Royce was spoken in hushed tones, a dark legend that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to recall his unsettling actions. Dr. Royce had once been a respected figure, renowned for his meticulous work as the town's coroner and his unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth behind each death he investigated. But over time, whispers began to spread about his increasingly erratic behavior. Colleagues noticed his obsession with the dead, a fixation that grew more unhinged with each passing year. It was said that he lingered in the morgue long after hours, conducting experiments that blurred the line between science and the grotesque. The rumors peaked when a series of unexplained disappearances began to plague the town. Bodies reportedly went missing from the morgue, only to reappear days later in altered, inexplicable states. Some locals claimed to have seen Dr. Royce wandering the streets late at night, his eyes wild and haunted, as if searching for something or someone. Then, one stormy night, Dr. Royce himself vanished without a trace. His office was found in chaos, papers strewn everywhere, the morgue door left ajar. The townspeople whispered that he had finally crossed a line he couldn't return from, succumbing to the darkness he had embraced for so long. I first heard about Dr. Royce's legend when I started as an intern at the local hospital. The tales were shared in hushed voices, half jokes but with an underlying edge of fear. It was impossible not to feel a flicker of apprehension whenever I walked past the morgue, especially during my night shifts. But I told myself they were just stories, until one particularly stormy night when I found myself alone on duty. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled through the narrow alleys outside, rattling the old building. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows on the tiled walls. I moved between the cold storage units, checking the logbook and confirming the inventory of bodies, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. The stories of Dr. Royce crept into my mind despite my best efforts to ignore them. The idea of a former coroner haunting this very space seemed absurd, but the uneasy sensation wouldn't leave. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind felt amplified in the stillness. As I finished logging the last entry, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the morgue, making me jump. I turned quickly, my flashlight sweeping the area, revealing a stack of boxes toppled over, their contents scattered across the floor. My breath came faster, and I tried to tell myself it was just the storm. But then I noticed one of the refrigeration unit doors slightly ajar, its pale white light spilling onto the floor. That door had been closed. I was so certain of it. Heart pounding, I approached the unit, every step feeling heavier than the last. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it hadn't latched properly, or maybe someone had been in here before me. But deep down, I felt the prickling sensation of dread that warned me something wasn't right. With trembling hands, I pulled the door open. Inside lay the body of a young woman, serene in death, her face untouched by the violence that had claimed her life. For a moment I exhaled in relief. Everything seemed normal until the temperature dropped sharply, a chill so intense it felt like the air itself had frozen. The lights flickered again, and in the brief darkness I thought I saw something move, a shadow darting across the wall. My breath caught in my throat as the lights returned, steady but dimmer than before. I turned back to the body and gasped. Her eyes were open. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stool. The woman's face hadn't changed, but her unblinking eyes seemed to lock onto mine, as if accusing me of something. My rational mind screamed at me that it was impossible, but I couldn't look away. Then I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "Why didn't you stop him?" I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice came again, louder, carrying a mixture of sorrow and rage. "Why didn't you stop him?" I wanted to respond, to explain that I had no idea what she meant, but my voice caught in my throat. The air around me felt suffocating, the cold biting into my skin. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I thought I saw another figure. Tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Dr. Royce. I bolted. My feet barely touched the floor as I fled the morgue, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The storm outside seemed less terrifying than the horrors within those walls. As I burst through the doors into the night, the whispers still echoed in my ears, and I could feel eyes on me, watching me as I disappeared into the rain. The next morning I returned to my duties as though nothing had happened, but the weight of that night lingered. The stories of Dr. Royce were no longer just tales. His legacy lived on in the shadows of the morgue, a grim reminder that some histories refuse to stay buried. I had been a coroner for over a decade, a job that had shown me more about the harsh realities of life and death than I sometimes felt I could bear. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the emotional weight of handling the body of a young girl. The day started like any other. Paperwork, the steady hum of refrigeration units in the morgue. Then the call came in about a tragic accident. A 7-year-old girl named Emma had been struck by a car. The knot in my stomach tightened as I prepared to receive her. Losing a child was always the hardest. It wasn't just death. It was innocence stolen too soon. When Emma arrived, I steeled myself, pushing aside the rising wave of sorrow. I had seen countless bodies in my career, but there was something profoundly different about this one. When I pulled back the sheet, I froze. Her small, delicate frame lay still on the cold metal table, her golden curls framing a face that looked peaceful, as though she were only sleeping. My heart ached for the parents who would never again hear her laugh or see her smile. As I began the examination, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation persisted, growing stronger with every passing moment. Then, faint and unmistakable, I heard it. A soft giggle. It wasn't possible. My rational mind rebelled against what I'd heard, but the sound was so clear, so out of place, that it sent chills down my spine. I glanced around, trying to convince myself it was just the echo of the room or a trick of the mind. But there was nothing. No one. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about Emma. The giggle haunted me. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The sound returned occasionally, always faint, always childlike, filling the stillness of the morgue with an eerie warmth that was both comforting and terrifying. It was as though Emma was still there, reminding me of the joy she had brought to the world even in her absence. The weight of her presence became unbearable. I withdrew from my colleagues, unable to share what I was experiencing. How could I explain it without sounding unhinged? The laughter of the other staff rang hollow to me, their jokes grating against my frayed nerves. I found myself staring at the walls of the morgue, lost in thought, the faint giggle playing over and over in my mind. One stormy night, as the wind howled and rain lashed against the windows, I stayed late to finish my work. The room felt different that night, heavier, darker. As I was about to close up, I heard the giggle again, this time clearer, closer, almost like it was right beside me. I froze, my heart racing. "Emma," I whispered, the name catching in my throat. The giggle stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. My chest tightened as the oppressive weight of the room pressed down on me. I couldn't stay. I couldn't do this anymore. That night, I made the decision to leave. Handling Emma's body, hearing her laughter, feeling her presence, it had broken something in me. The job I had once found purpose in had become a source of unbearable pain. The line between life and death had blurred in ways that left me vulnerable and exposed, pulling me into a darkness I couldn't escape. As I packed my belongings, a strange mix of relief and sadness washed over me. I knew I was leaving behind not only a profession, but a part of myself. Yet I also knew I couldn't continue carrying the weight of those I couldn't save. When I walked out of the morgue for the last time, I took a deep breath. The night air was cold but refreshing, and for the first time in weeks, the pressure in my chest began to lift. I would carry the memory of Emma with me, a bittersweet reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. Though I left the morgue behind, her laughter still lingers in my mind, a haunting melody that has taught me to appreciate the fleeting beauty of life, even in its most fragile moments. I've always been drawn to the macabre. As a kid, I spent countless hours exploring the dusty corners of my grandfather's attic, rifling through relics of the past and imagining the lives they belonged to. As an adult, it wasn't surprising that I ended up working as an assistant at the local funeral home. The place carried an air of quiet sorrow and mystery, a perfect fit for someone like me. One evening, something arrived that I'll never forget. A locked coffin, unexpected and shrouded in intrigue, was wheeled into the viewing room. The staff exchanged curious glances, whispering among themselves, but no one seemed to know its story. It was stunning. A deep mahogany casket adorned with intricate carvings that seemed almost alive in the dim light. The lock was old and rusted, like it had been untouched for decades. The arrival of the coffin set off a flurry of speculation. Whose body was inside? Why was it locked? Mr. Grayson, the stoic funeral director, offered no answers. His silence only heightened the tension in the room. I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and unease as I stared at the casket. The stories I'd heard over the years about restless spirits and unexplained happenings buzzed in my mind, but I had always dismissed them as folklore. As the night wore on and the others left, curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't resist the pull of the coffin. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights as I approached it. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the lock, and I hesitated. What was I hoping to find? Finally, I retrieved a small tool from my pocket. It only took a few moments of work before I heard the soft click of the lock giving way. My heart raced as I lifted the lid. The coffin was empty. Confusion washed over me as I stared at the plush velvet lining. I had expected anything but this. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. Just as I was about to shut the lid, a flicker of movement caught my eye. From the shadows, a figure emerged. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. A man stood before me, pale and gaunt, his hollow eyes boring into mine. He wore a tattered suit, and his skin looked cold and clammy, as if he had just risen from the grave. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The man's presence was surreal, like a waking nightmare. Panic surged through me, and I instinctively stepped back. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? How was this happening? "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I need to get out of here." I wanted to run, but something rooted me in place. His eyes, filled with a strange mixture of fear and longing, held me there. For a brief moment I felt connected to him, as though I could sense his pain, the weight of a life cut short. "I don't belong here," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The coffin wasn't just empty. It was a doorway. This man wasn't alive. He was a soul trapped between worlds, desperate for release. The air grew colder, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. As he reached out toward me, I felt an overwhelming surge of fear and empathy. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but his gaze held a strange power. I shook my head, my voice trembling as I spoke. "I can't help you," I whispered. "I'm sorry." His expression shifted from desperation to resignation, and my chest tightened. The figure began to fade, the shadows swallowing him until he disappeared completely. The silence that followed was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. For a long moment I stood there, staring at the now empty coffin. The encounter had shaken me to my core, a stark reminder that the boundaries between life and death were thinner than I'd ever imagined. I closed the lid and stepped away, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. Some mysteries, I realized, are not meant to be unraveled. The allure of the unknown could lead to unsettling truths, and there were forces in the world far beyond my comprehension. That night changed me. As I left the funeral home, I carried with me a newfound respect for the delicate balance of life and death. Some doors, I learned, are better left closed. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. It was a slow night at the morgue, the kind I usually welcomed. There was a rhythm to this job, a quiet that felt almost sacred. But tonight the silence felt heavier than usual. I had just finished logging the paperwork for the day's arrivals when the call came in. A fatal car crash, 2 victims, one pronounced dead at the scene, and the other en route to the hospital in critical condition. When the body arrived, the coroner was already gone for the night, leaving me to handle intake. The man was in his 30s, his face bloodied and swollen, his body marked with deep gashes and contusions. The report said he had been ejected from his car after colliding with a truck. I sighed and wheeled the gurney into the prep room, the tires squeaking against the linoleum floor. The room was bright, almost glaring under the fluorescent lights. The contrast between the sterile environment and the broken body on the table was stark. As I pulled the sheet back, a sudden cold draft brushed against my face. I paused, glancing at the vents. The morgue was always cold, but this was different, sharp, like an icy breath. I busied myself with the standard routine, documenting personal effects, noting injuries, prepping for the autopsy in the morning. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, and the faint hum of the refrigeration units seemed louder than usual. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. It came from the far corner of the room where the storage lockers stood. At first, I thought it might be a loose pipe or the cooling system acting up, but the sound was deliberate, steady, almost purposeful. I froze, my pen hovering over the clipboard. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. No answer. The tapping stopped. I shook my head, chalking it up to my imagination. Long shifts could mess with your mind, and the silence of the morgue often played tricks on you. I returned to my work, trying to focus on the task at hand. A few minutes later, the sound returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the lockers, it was coming from the gurney. The man's hand had fallen off the edge, his fingers dangling limply over the side. The tapping had been his fingernails brushing against the metal frame. A chill swept through me and my chest tightened. I stared at the hand, willing it to be still. Slowly, I moved toward the gurney and lifted his arm back onto the table. The skin was ice cold, rigid with rigor mortis. There was no way it could have moved on its own. As I stepped back, the lights flickered. The room dimmed for a moment, plunging me into a semi-darkness before the bulbs buzzed back to life. My heart pounded as I glanced around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. Then the gurney moved. Not much, just an inch or two, but enough to make the wheels creak against the floor. I backed away, my breathing shallow, my mind racing for a rational explanation. Maybe the floor was uneven. Maybe I had bumped it without realizing. And then I heard the whisper. It was faint, almost lost beneath the hum of the refrigeration units. "Why didn't you stop?" My blood ran cold. The man's eyes were still closed, his body lifeless, but the words had come from him. I was sure of it. "I didn't," I stammered, my voice shaking. "I didn't do anything." The whisper came again, louder this time. "You didn't stop. Why didn't you stop?" The lights flickered once more, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air as I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The room fell silent again, but the sense of dread remained. I could feel his presence, heavy and accusing, pressing down on me. The whispers stopped, but the lights continued to flicker and the cold lingered. I grabbed my clipboard and fled the room, leaving the gurney and its occupant behind. The next morning I found out that the man who had died in the crash had been fleeing the scene of another accident, a hit-and-run that had killed a pedestrian. His car had struck a man crossing the street, and instead of stopping, he had sped away, only to lose control minutes later. The memory of that whisper, "Why didn't you stop?" still haunts me. It wasn't meant for me, but I can't shake the feeling that somehow I became part of his reckoning that night. I've always been drawn to the peculiarities of life, and my job at the funeral home only deepened that fascination. There's something about the stillness of the place, steeped in history and layered with the stories of those who've passed on, that I found both comforting and unsettling. One quiet afternoon, while organizing inventory, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from one of the locked rooms at the back of the building. My heart picked up pace as curiosity nudged me forward. The door was old and heavy, its wood worn from years of use. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated. What could possibly be behind it? Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. The air was stale, tinged with the faint scent of flowers, a lingering reminder of the lives honored here. As my eyes adjusted, I saw him. A man slumped against the far wall, his clothes rumpled and his hair disheveled. He looked utterly lost. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the oppressive silence. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice trembling with confusion. A chill crept over me as I took in his appearance. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. "You're in the funeral home," I replied gently, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" "I don't remember. I just woke up here." My pulse quickened. His fear was palpable, tugging at some deep instinct to protect, but something deep inside screamed at me to stay on guard. "Let's get you out of here," I offered, taking a step forward and reaching out to him. But as I moved closer, he recoiled violently, pressing himself against the wall. "No, don't," he shouted, panic twisting his voice. I froze. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said softly, trying to reassure him. But his eyes darted around the room, his terror almost tangible. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare. Then the lights flickered, casting eerie, jagged shadows across the room. My unease deepened, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Before I could react, he bolted past me, his movement so sudden it left me frozen in place. He dashed down the hallway, his footsteps echoing, and by the time I gathered myself enough to follow, he had vanished. The silence that enveloped the building was heavier than ever, oppressive and unnerving. Later that evening, just as I was settling in for the night shift, the director called me. "We've got a new arrival," he said, his voice calm but clipped. "Can you come to the viewing room?" My stomach dropped as I made my way there, a sense of dread settling in my chest. When I entered, I saw him, the same man who had been slumped against the wall. Now he lay lifeless in a casket, his face pale but eerily peaceful. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching. How could this be? I had just seen him alive, terrified and disoriented. Now he was here, motionless and serene. I stepped closer, my legs trembling beneath me. The reality of the situation hit me in waves, each one heavier than the last. It was as if I had stepped into a realm where life and death were no longer separate, where the boundaries blurred into something unrecognizable. The stories I'd heard over the years about spirits lingering in funeral homes flooded my mind. I'd always brushed them off as folklore, tales born of grief and imagination. But now, standing before this man, I couldn't dismiss them. Had his spirit been trapped here, lost and confused, only to find peace in death? That night I couldn't shake the memory of his face, both the fear I'd seen earlier and the calm expression in the casket. The flickering lights, the rustling sound, and the vanishing act all felt connected, as if I had been part of something far greater than myself, something I couldn't begin to understand. In the days that followed, his memory lingered with me, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the mysteries that lie beyond it. I found myself looking at my work differently, approaching each day with a newfound respect for the lives that had passed through this place. The experience left an indelible mark on me, deepening my understanding of the connections we share, even in death. I learned that some encounters defy explanation, and that perhaps in those brief moments, the living and the departed are closer than we think. I've worked the night shift at the county morgue for 3 years. It's a quiet job, most nights anyway. But one night, about a year ago, I encountered something I'll never forget. It was close to midnight when they brought him in. A young man, mid-20s, the victim of a horrific motorcycle accident. The paramedics said he had lost control on a curve, crashing into a guardrail. His body was battered, his leather jacket shredded, and his helmet cracked in two. A part of me felt an overwhelming sadness for him, for the life he had lost so suddenly. But there was no time for sentiment. I had work to do. I wheeled his body into the prep room, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. The sterile, clinical smell of the morgue mingled with the faint, metallic scent of blood. The room was cold, the temperature always kept low to preserve the bodies. I pulled the sheet back to start my examination, and that's when the first strange thing happened. His eyes were open. That alone wasn't unusual. Sometimes they don't close completely after death. But these were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I shook it off. "Just another body," I whispered to myself. "Don't make it weird." I reached for his personal effects, a wallet, keys, and a silver ring that had been removed at the scene. As I logged them, the faint smell of burnt rubber filled the room. My first thought was that it had lingered from the accident, but it seemed stronger now, as if the crash had just happened again. The scent was suffocating, almost like it was being pumped into the room. Then came the whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the refrigeration units. "Help me." It was so soft I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. I froze, my pen hovering over the log sheet. The morgue was empty, just me and him. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly turned to look at the body. Nothing had changed except for the oppressive feeling that I was no longer alone. I tried to focus on my work. My hands were shaky as I adjusted the overhead light to examine the injuries. His skin was pale, a network of abrasions and bruises covering his arms and torso. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that his lifeless eyes were following me. Every time I glanced up, it felt as though they shifted just slightly. I leaned closer to inspect a deep laceration across his chest. That's when I saw it. His lips moved. A sharp intake of breath caught in my throat. They weren't fully moving, just a faint twitch, as though he were trying to say something. I stepped back, my pulse racing. "This isn't possible," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, like a fragile attempt to rationalize what I was witnessing. "Help me." The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't my imagination. The voice was soft but unmistakably real. I backed away from the table, nearly tripping over the stool behind me. The smell of burnt rubber grew stronger, and the room felt colder, as though the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam trembling as I swept it across the room. Everything appeared normal, until I turned it back to the table. His head had turned. Not completely, just slightly to the side, but enough to face me directly. My breath hitched as I stared into those lifeless eyes, now undeniably locked onto mine. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. "Don't leave me." The voice was louder now, and it came not from the air around me, but from the body on the table. I froze, my hand gripping the cold metal handle of the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Was I losing it? Was this some strange muscle reflex? But deep down, I knew this was something far beyond explanation. The lights flickered again, and a deafening silence filled the room, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The lights steadied, the smell of burnt rubber dissipated, and the body lay motionless once more. I didn't finish the examination that night. I left the morgue without turning back, my heart pounding in my chest. When I returned the next day, the body was gone, transferred to the funeral home. I didn't mention what happened to anyone. Who would believe me? But even now, every time I hear the distant roar of a motorcycle engine, I think of him, and I wonder if he's still out there whispering for help in the dead of night. That evening, the funeral home was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost reverent, as I prepared to embalm the body of Mr. Whitaker, a man whose life had touched so many in our small town. He'd been a pillar of the community, known for his kindness and charitable work, the kind of person whose absence leaves an undeniable void. I entered the preparation room, taking a deep breath as I steadied myself for the task ahead. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a stark, sterile glow over the room. On the stainless steel table lay his body, covered by a crisp white sheet. As I pulled back the sheet, revealing Mr. Whitaker's face, I couldn't shake the weight of the moment. I'd handled countless bodies before, but this one felt different. His presence, or maybe his absence, seemed to fill the room in a way I couldn't explain. The chill in the room deepened as I began my work. At first, I dismissed it as the usual draft or the effect of the cold temperature we kept for preservation, but the sensation lingered, wrapping around me like an unseen presence. It was unnerving. I tried to focus, but out of the corner of my eye I thought I saw movement. I glanced up sharply, only to find everything still. I chuckled nervously to myself. "Get a grip," I muttered. But the unease didn't go away. Then, as I turned back to Mr. Whitaker's face, I saw it, or thought I did. A flicker in his closed eyelids, so subtle I questioned whether it had happened at all. My breath hitched and I leaned closer, but his eyes remained shut. "It's just your imagination," I whispered, trying to convince myself. I kept working, but the strange feeling persisted. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, I found myself speaking to him. "You were a good man, Mr. Whitaker. Everyone in town respected you. They'll miss you." And that's when it happened. His lips moved. Not a lot, just a faint twitch, but enough to make my heart stop. I froze, staring at his face. Then his lips curved into the faintest of smiles. A chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled back a step, my tools clattering onto the tray. My mind raced for a rational explanation, a muscle spasm maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The air in the room felt charged, and for the first time I sensed I wasn't alone. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was overwhelming. I felt as though Mr. Whitaker was still there, watching me, or perhaps listening. The lights flickered, plunging the room into shadow for a brief moment before buzzing back to life. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I fought the urge to leave the room altogether. And then, as I stood frozen in place, I thought I heard it. A soft chuckle, barely more than a whisper, but enough to send goosebumps crawling over my arms. My head snapped toward the source of the sound, his face. The faint smile was still there, almost reassuring. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, and it felt as though he wanted me to know that everything was all right. I forced myself to finish the job, though my hands trembled the entire time. When I was done, I stood back, staring at him for a moment. The smile on his face was still faintly visible, but this time it didn't frighten me. It felt peaceful. As I turned to leave, the weight of the experience settled heavily on me. I'd always thought of my job as clinical, detached, but this encounter had shaken something loose inside me. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The smile, the chuckle, the presence in the room. I started to wonder about the line between life and death, how thin it might actually be. Eventually, I realized I needed to step away. The funeral home, once a place of routine, had become a place of unanswered questions and lingering shadows. I needed time to process everything, to reflect on what I had experienced. Even now, I carry the memory of that night with me. The way Mr. Whitaker seemed to bridge the divide between this world and whatever comes next. It changed the way I think about death and life, too. Some encounters leave marks on your soul, and this one left a deep, lasting impression on mine. I've worked as an autopsy assistant for 5 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Gunshot victims, drownings, even the occasional decomposed body. But nothing could have prepared me for the night they brought them in. The call came just after 10 p.m., a major accident at a crowded outdoor festival. A stage collapse, they said, followed by a panicked stampede. Multiple fatalities. My supervisor's voice was calm, but I could hear the tension in his words. "This one's going to be rough," he warned. "Get ready." I wasn't ready. No one could be. When the first gurney arrived, I caught a glimpse of the paramedics' faces, pale, shaken. They were used to trauma, but even they looked haunted. The body was covered with a blood-soaked sheet, and I braced myself as I wheeled it into the prep room. More gurneys followed, each one bearing another victim of the chaos. The prep room quickly filled with the smell of blood and sweat, mingling with the metallic tang of the stainless steel tables. I pulled on my gloves, the latex snapping against my wrists, and steeled myself for what lay ahead. One by one, we began to uncover the bodies. The first victim was a man in his early 30s. His face was intact, but his body was mangled beyond recognition. His right leg was gone, torn off at the hip, and his chest looked as though it had been trampled by a stampede of panicked feet. I tried not to think about the moments before his death, the terror he must have felt, the helplessness. The second body was worse. A young woman, maybe in her 20s. Her face was unrecognizable, crushed by a falling beam. One arm was missing entirely, leaving a jagged stump that had bled out before she could be rescued. I paused, staring at the empty space where her arm should have been, and swallowed hard. "Keep going," I told myself. "Just do the work." The third gurney was empty, or so I thought at first. Then I realized it carried only fragments, a severed hand, a piece of a forearm, and a bloodied section of scalp. My stomach turned, and I had to look away. It wasn't the gore that got to me. It was the thought that these fragments were all that remained of someone who had been alive and whole just hours earlier. As the night wore on, the room grew colder, the overhead lights casting harsh shadows that made everything feel even more surreal. The hum of the refrigeration units droned on, a constant reminder of where I was and what I was doing. My hands worked on autopilot, cleaning wounds, documenting injuries, and preparing the bodies for autopsy. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene I hadn't witnessed but could imagine all too clearly: the screams, the crush of bodies, the overwhelming panic. At some point I realized I wasn't alone. Not in the usual sense. I knew my supervisor was in the adjoining room, but I felt something else, a presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner. There was nothing, of course, but the feeling didn't go away. Then I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a gasp. I froze, my gloved hands hovering over the body in front of me. It wasn't possible. These people were dead. I checked for pulses, documented the absence of life. But the sound came again, soft and fleeting, like someone struggling to breathe. I turned toward the source, my heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from the second Gurney, the young woman with the crushed face. I stared at her lifeless form, waiting, listening. The room was silent except for the hum of the units. Then her remaining hand twitched. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was impossible, a post-mortem reflex, I told myself. Just a nerve firing one last time. But as I watched, her hand moved again, this time more deliberately. Her fingers curled, then relaxed, as if she were trying to reach for something. A wave of cold swept through the room, and the overhead lights flickered. The temperature seemed to plummet, my breath visible in the air. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the Gurney. And then I heard it. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. "Help me." My legs gave out, and I stumbled against the counter, gripping the edge to keep from collapsing. The whisper came again, louder this time, filled with desperation. "Help me." I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the door. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, images I couldn't shake. Was it real? A trick of my imagination? I didn't care. I had to get out of that room. The last thing I saw before I fled was her hand, still twitching, reaching toward the edge of the table. I never spoke about that night, not to my supervisor, not to anyone. I finished my shift in silence, and when the bodies were transferred to the medical examiner's office the next day, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted. But the memory lingers. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that whisper in my mind, "Help me." And I wonder if some part of her is still trapped, reaching out, searching for peace in the chaos that took her life. As we conclude this chilling exploration of supernatural experiences in funeral homes, we encourage you to engage with the content. If you found these stories as captivating and thought-provoking as we did, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay updated on our latest videos, which will continue to delve into the mysteries of life, death, and the supernatural. Don't forget to like and share this video with friends and family who may also be intrigued by the eerie tales we've uncovered. Your support helps us bring more chilling stories to light, allowing us to explore the unknown together. And as we close the cold, steel doors of the morgue tonight, remember this: the dead may rest, but not all remain silent. In the stillness of the night, when the fluorescent lights flicker and shadows stretch unnaturally, who's to say the bodies on those gurneys don't stir? Beware the quiet whispers, the faint movement in the corner of your eye, for the line between life and death may not only be crossed, but may come back to haunt us. Sleep tight, and pray they stay where they belong.